Hey guys, tonight I want to take you on a journey to ancient Egypt, to a time when the gods walked among mortals and their emotions could reshape the very fabric of reality. Tonight, we're going to explore how one ancient goddess, Tefnut, the fierce lioness of moisture and rain, saved the entire land of Egypt through an act that began as rebellion but ended as redemption. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video if these journeys bring you a little closer to rest. It's always a pleasure to see our community of listeners, so let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Picture this. The year is approximately 2000 BCE, and Egypt is experiencing one of the most catastrophic droughts in its ancient history. The Nile River, that life-giving serpent of water that has sustained civilization for millennia, has begun to dwindle. The mighty flood that annually renews the black earth of the delta comes weaker each year. Crops wither in fields that once flourished green as emeralds under the Egyptian sun. The granaries, once overflowing with golden wheat and barley, grow emptier by the season, and in the great temples of Heliopolis, the priests whisper anxiously about the anger of the gods. But to understand how Egypt came to this crisis, we must journey back to the very beginning of creation itself, to that primordial time when the universe was nothing but the dark, endless waters of Nun, a cosmic ocean of pure potential where no light had ever shone. In this watery void, there existed only one being, Atum, the self-created god who would later be known as Ra, the supreme solar deity. Imagine him floating in that endless darkness, contemplating existence itself. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of primordial waters against nothing. There was no shore, no horizon, no up or down, just infinite possibility waiting to be shaped by divine will. From this perfect solitude, Atum-Ra began the act of creation. In some versions of this ancient tale, he sneezed, a surprisingly human gesture from the supreme deity, though perhaps it makes perfect sense when you consider that creation often begins with the smallest, most unexpected moments. From this divine sneeze emerged two beings, Shu, the god of air and dryness, and his twin sister Tefnut, the goddess of moisture and rain. But other versions tell us that Atum spat them forth, and there's something beautifully symbolic about this act. Think about it, moisture and air, the very breath of life, emerging from the mouth of the creator god. The word Tefnut itself may derive from the Egyptian word for to spit, connecting her forever to that first moment when the cosmic waters gave birth to the elements that would sustain all life. Tefnut was born as a lioness goddess, fierce and magnificent, with eyes that held the power of storms and a voice that could summon rain from the driest desert sky. Her brother Shu appeared as the space between earth and heaven, the very atmosphere we breathe. Together, they represented the fundamental forces that would make life possible. The dry air that carries sound and breath, and the life-giving moisture that nourishes every growing thing. As twins born from the same divine breath, Shu and Tefnut became husband and wife, a union that in the cosmic scale represented the perfect balance between moisture and dryness, between the rain that feeds the earth and the wind that carries the clouds. Their love story was one of eternal complementarity, two forces that seem opposite but are actually inseparable parts of a greater whole. From their union came the next generation of cosmic forces, Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. Picture Geb as the solid ground beneath our feet, rich with minerals and life, while Nut arched above him as the star-spangled canopy of heaven. But here's where things got complicated in the divine family tree. Geb and Nut fell so deeply in love that they locked themselves in an eternal embrace, making it impossible for life to flourish between them. Into this cosmic crisis stepped Shu, the god of air. With tremendous effort, he pushed his way between his children, lifting Nut high above Geb and creating the space we know as the atmosphere. This separation was crucial. Without it, there would be no room for rivers to flow, for plants to grow, for humans and animals to walk the earth. Shu literally held up the sky, and in artistic depictions you'll often see him with his arms raised above his head, supporting the star-covered body of Nut while standing upon the prone form of Geb. But Tefnut had her own crucial role in this cosmic arrangement. As the goddess of moisture, she worked alongside her husband to maintain the delicate balance that allowed life to thrive. She was the dew that gathered on lotus petals at dawn, the rain that filled the Nile during the annual flood, the tears of joy that Ra wept when he first saw his creation. She was both gentle and fierce, nurturing when the world needed sustenance, terrible when the cosmic order was threatened. Now, as the creator god Ra established his reign over the newly formed world, he took counsel from his children and grandchildren. But among all his divine offspring, Tefnut held a special place. She became what the Egyptians called the Eye of Ra, not just a metaphor, but an actual divine force that served as the sun god's agent in the world. The Eye of Ra was a complex concept, representing both protection and destruction, love and wrath, the nurturing aspects of sunlight and its burning, purifying fire. Think of the Eye of Ra as a divine spotlight that could focus Ra's attention and power wherever it was needed. When the eye rested peacefully upon Ra's brow, all was well in the world. The sun rose and set in its proper rhythm, the Nile flooded on schedule, crops grew abundantly, and humans lived in harmony with the divine order. But when the eye became active, when it took on a life of its own, extraordinary things happened, sometimes wonderful, sometimes terrible. Tefnut, as one of the primary manifestations of this eye, held incredible power. She could appear as a gentle woman with the head of a lioness, crowned with the solar disk that marked her as Ra's daughter. But she could also transform into a full lioness, fierce and unstoppable, breathing fire and bringing the wrath of heaven down upon those who threatened the cosmic order. For countless centuries this arrangement worked beautifully. Tefnut served her father faithfully, bringing rain when it was needed, withholding it when the land required rest. She was the moisture in the air that allowed humans to breathe comfortably, the dew that nourished the desert plants, the tears of compassion that Ra shed for his human children. Egypt flourished under this divine protection, becoming the most advanced civilization on Earth. But something began to change in the relationship between Ra and his daughter. Some versions of the story tell us that Ra, growing old in his role as pharaoh of both gods and mortals, began to make decisions that troubled Tefnut. Others suggest that she became jealous when Ra began to pay more attention to her younger siblings and their descendants. Still others hint that Tefnut simply grew tired of being taken for granted, of being expected to perform her duties without recognition or appreciation. Whatever the exact cause, tensions began to build in the divine household. Tefnut found herself increasingly at odds with her father's policies and decisions. She watched as humans began to forget their proper reverence for the gods, as they became complacent and careless with the gifts they had been given. She saw the sacred rituals performed hastily or carelessly, offerings made grudgingly rather than with genuine gratitude. The breaking point came, according to the ancient texts, when Ra made a decision that Tefnut simply could not accept. In some versions, he elevated another goddess to a position that Tefnut felt rightfully belonged to her. In others, he issued a decree that would have diminished her authority over the rains and floods that Egypt depended upon. The exact details vary depending on which papyrus you read, but the result was the same. Tefnut's legendary temper finally exploded. What do you think it would be like to witness the rage of a goddess? For me, it has to be one of the most terrifying sights imaginable. The idea that divine fury could literally reshape the world around you, that's a truly frightening thought. The confrontation between Ra and Tefnut shook the very foundations of heaven. Her voice, when raised in anger, was like thunder rolling across the desert. Her eyes blazed with the fire of 100 suns, and her lioness form grew to tremendous proportions. The other gods cowered as father and daughter faced each other in a battle of wills that would determine the fate of all creation. In her fury, Tefnut spoke words that had never been uttered before in the divine realm. She rejected her father's authority, declared her independence from his rule, and announced that she would no longer serve as his eye or agent in the world. The cosmos itself seemed to hold its breath as these unprecedented words echoed through the halls of heaven. But Tefnut didn't stop with mere words. In a display of divine power that left even Ra stunned, she began to transform. Her lioness form grew larger and more fierce, her mane crackling with electrical energy, her claws extending like curved daggers. And then, with a roar that shattered the peace of eternity, she bounded away from her father's presence and disappeared into the cosmic void. But where could a goddess go when she wanted to escape the land of her birth? The answer lay to the south of Egypt, in the mysterious region the Egyptians called Nubia. This was a land of deep deserts and rocky cataracts, where the Nile became wild and dangerous as it tumbled over granite rapids. It was a place of extreme heat and occasional violent storms, a landscape that seemed almost alien compared to the ordered fields and cities of Egypt. Nubia represented everything that was foreign and potentially threatening to the Egyptian worldview. While Egypt was the Black Land, fertile and predictable, Nubia was part of the Red Land, the desert realm of chaos and unpredictability. It was the perfect place for an angry goddess to make her new home. But Tefnut's departure from Egypt was no simple journey. As she traveled south following the course of the Nile toward its mysterious sources, she took something crucial with her, all the moisture and rainfall that Egypt depended upon. Every drop of dew, every breath of humid air, every cloud that might have brought blessed rain, all of it followed Tefnut into her southern exile. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. The annual flood, that miracle of timing that had sustained Egyptian civilization for thousands of years, simply failed to arrive. The Nile, instead of rising to spread life-giving silt across the fields, remained at its lowest level. The irrigation canals, normally filled to capacity during flood season, cracked and dried. The sacred pools in the temples began to evaporate, leaving only bitter salt deposits behind. But the drought was only the beginning of Egypt's troubles. As the moisture departed with Tefnut, the very air became difficult to breathe. The humidity that had made the desert heat bearable vanished, leaving a dry, searing wind that cracked lips and parched throats. Wells that had provided water for generations suddenly ran dry. The few remaining pools became brackish and undrinkable. The agricultural consequences were swift and merciless. The wheat and barley that formed the backbone of Egyptian society withered in the fields before they could be harvested. The date palms, normally resilient desert trees, began to drop their leaves and fruit. The carefully tended gardens that provided vegetables for the common people turned to dust and sand. Even the hardy acacia trees that marked the boundary between cultivation and desert began to die. In the cities and towns, life became a daily struggle for survival. The great granaries that had stored surplus grain for lean years were quickly emptied. Bread, the staple food of both rich and poor, became scarce and expensive. Water, once taken for granted, became more precious than gold. People began to fight over access to the few remaining wells and springs. The sacred animals that were so important to Egyptian religion began to suffer and die. The bulls and cows that represented various gods grew thin and weak. The sacred cats that protected the temples from rats and mice began to disappear as their prey fled to whatever distant lands still had water. Even the crocodiles in the Nile, normally abundant and feared, became rare sights as the river level dropped to unprecedented lows. But perhaps the most heartbreaking consequence of Tefnut's departure was what happened to the children. In a land where infant mortality was already high, the drought and famine pushed child deaths to catastrophic levels. Parents who had already lost so much watched helplessly as their remaining children grew thin and weak. The sound of mourning became constant in every neighborhood as families buried the youngest and most vulnerable members of their communities. The priests in the temples tried desperately to understand what had gone wrong with the cosmic order. They performed ritual after ritual, offered sacrifice after sacrifice, trying to restore the balance that had kept Egypt prosperous for so long. But the altars remained dry, the sacred pools empty, and the gods seemed to have turned their faces away from the land they had once loved. In the great temple of Heliopolis, where Ra was worshipped as the supreme deity, the high priests consulted the ancient texts and performed divination rituals trying to discover the catastrophe. It was they who first realized the connection between Tefnut's disappearance and Egypt's suffering. They understood that the goddess of moisture had literally taken Egypt's life, sustaining water with her when she fled to the south. As news of this discovery spread throughout the land, the people's despair deepened. How could mortals possibly convince an angry goddess to return? What offerings could they make that would be sufficient to appease divine wrath? The priests had no answers, and even the pharaoh, himself considered a god incarnate, seemed powerless in the face of this cosmic crisis. Meanwhile, in the harsh deserts of Nubia, Tefnut had undergone her own transformation. Her anger at her father and her homeland had changed her into something far more fierce and dangerous than she had ever been before. She had become, in the words of the ancient texts, a Nubian cat, a lioness of tremendous size and fury who roamed the desert killing everything she encountered. But this wasn't the selective, purposeful violence of a predator hunting for food. This was the indiscriminate rage of a goddess whose heart had been broken by betrayal and disappointment. Tefnut, in her lioness form, attacked any living thing that crossed her path. Humans, animals, even the spirits of the desert, nothing was safe from her wrath. The Nubian people, who had always been skilled warriors and survivors in this harsh landscape, found themselves terrorized by a supernatural predator unlike anything they had ever faced. Their arrows could not pierce her divine hide, their spears shattered against her supernatural strength. Entire villages were abandoned as word spread of the demon lioness who could appear anywhere, strike without warning, and vanish into the desert like a sandstorm. But Tefnut's rage wasn't just directed outward. In her heart, she carried a deep pain that no amount of violence could heal. She had lost her father's love, abandoned her beloved brother Shu, and left behind the land where she had been worshipped and honored for millennia. Her fury was, in many ways, a manifestation of her own profound grief and loneliness. As the seasons passed, though in her exile, Tefnut barely noticed the passage of time. The goddess began to understand the full consequences of her actions. Through her divine senses, she could perceive the suffering in Egypt, could feel the prayers and tears of the people who had once honored her. She could sense the slow death of the land she had helped to create and sustain. But her pride prevented her from simply returning home. She had made her position clear when she left, had declared her independence from Ra's authority. To return now would mean admitting that she had been wrong, that her anger had led to terrible consequences. For a goddess of Tefnut's proud nature, such an admission seemed impossible. Back in Egypt, as the drought entered its second year, Ra finally accepted that the situation was beyond his ability to solve through divine decree or magical intervention. His daughter had made her choice freely, and even the supreme god could not simply force her to return against her will. This was a delicate diplomatic mission that would require subtlety, patience, and wisdom. Ra turned to the wisest of all the gods, Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of knowledge, writing, and divine counsel. If anyone could persuade Tefnut to return home, it would be Thoth. The god of wisdom had served as mediator in countless disputes among the gods, had helped resolve the great crises that had threatened cosmic order in the past. His silver tongue and deep understanding of divine psychology made him the perfect ambassador for this crucial mission. But Ra also knew that Thoth could not accomplish this task alone. Tefnut's connection to her brother Shu was one of the strongest bonds in all creation. The god of air and the goddess of moisture were complementary forces, each incomplete without the other. If anyone could reach Tefnut's heart and remind her of her true nature, it would be Shu. What do you imagine it would feel like to be chosen for such a vital mission? For me, it would be both an incredible honor and a terrifying responsibility. The fate of an entire civilization resting on your diplomatic skills, that's the kind of pressure that would keep me awake for weeks. So it was that Thoth and Shu began their journey to Nubia, traveling not as conquerors or judges, but as humble supplicants hoping to heal a broken family and save a dying land. They left behind the familiar temples and cities of Egypt and ventured into the harsh, unfamiliar landscape of the south, following rumors and reports of the demon lioness who had been terrorizing the region. The journey itself was perilous. The drought that had devastated Egypt extended into the northern regions of Nubia, making water scarce even for gods. The heat was more intense than anything they had experienced in Egypt, and the landscape was alien and hostile. Rocky outcroppings thrust up from sandy plains, creating a maze of canyons and ridges where a lioness could easily ambush unwary travelers. But Thoth and Shu were not ordinary travelers. Thoth, with his divine wisdom, could sense the subtle signs that marked Tefnut's passage through the desert. Broken rocks where her claws had scraped, sand fused into glass by the heat of her divine fury, the lingering scent of ozone that followed in her wake. Shu, as the god of air, could feel the disturbances in the atmosphere that marked her presence, could read the desert winds like a scroll written in an ancient language. As they travelled deeper into Nubia, they began to encounter the evidence of Tefnut's rage. Entire oases had been destroyed, their palm trees reduced to charred stumps, their springs poisoned with divine fire. The bones of animals and humans alike lay scattered across the desert floor, testament to the lioness goddess's indiscriminate fury. But they also began to sense something else, a profound loneliness that permeated the very air around them. Despite her fearsome reputation, Tefnut was not a naturally destructive goddess. Her true nature was to nurture and sustain life, not to destroy it. The violence she had committed was a perversion of her essential character, a symptom of the deep pain and isolation she felt in her exile. Finally, after many days of searching, they found her. The encounter took place at a remote oasis, one of the few sources of water remaining in the region. Tefnut had claimed it as her territory, driving away or killing any creature that dared to approach. She lay in the shade of the few surviving palm trees, her massive lioness form radiating heat and menace. When she first saw Thoth and Shu approaching, her reaction was immediate and violent. She rose to her full, terrifying height, her mane crackling with divine energy, her eyes blazing like twin suns. Her roar shattered the silence of the desert and sent clouds of sand swirling into the air. She was ready to attack, to add 2 more gods to her tally of victims. But Thoth, wise as always, had prepared for this moment. Instead of approaching as an equal, he took the form of a humble baboon, a creature associated with his wisdom and learning, but also with playfulness and harmlessness. In this form, he posed no threat to the angry lioness, appeared more like a curious visitor than a divine messenger. Shu, following his friend's lead, also transformed himself into a more humble form. As the god of air, he could make himself nearly invisible, a gentle breeze that stirred the sand around the oasis but posed no apparent danger to its fierce guardian. What followed was one of the most delicate and crucial conversations in all mythology. Thoth, speaking in his role as the baboon, began not with commands or demands, but with stories. He told Tefnut tales of the world beyond the desert, of the beauty and wonder that existed in distant lands. He spoke of the sunrise over the Mediterranean, of the storms that swept across the Ethiopian highlands, of the mysterious sources of the Nile far to the south where no god had ever traveled. His strategy was subtle but brilliant. Rather than immediately addressing Tefnut's anger or Egypt's suffering, he sought to awaken her curiosity about the wider world. He reminded her that she was a goddess of cosmic scope, not just a local deity tied to one particular land. He painted pictures with his words of all the wonders she might explore if she chose to leave her desert prison. But more importantly, He began to tell her stories that reflected her own situation. He spoke of other beings who had fled their homes in anger, of the loneliness they had experienced, of the unexpected joy they had found when they chose to return. These weren't direct parallels to her situation. Thoth was too wise to be so obvious, but they were stories that spoke to the heart of her condition. As Thoth spoke, something began to change in Tefnut's demeanor. The divine fire that had blazed in her eyes began to dim slightly. Her massive form relaxed just a little, no longer poised for immediate attack. She was listening, and in listening, she was beginning to remember parts of herself that had been buried under layers of rage and pride. Shu, as the gentle breeze, began to work his own subtle magic. He brought with him the scents and sensations of Egypt, the smell of lotus blossoms from the temple pools, the feeling of morning mist rising from the Nile, the sound of birds calling from the papyrus marshes. These sensory memories, carried on the wind he controlled, began to awaken Tefnut's homesickness. Honestly, what emotion do you find most powerful in bringing about change in your own life? For me, it has to be nostalgia. The memory of better times can be incredibly motivating when you're stuck in a difficult situation. But Tefnut was not easily swayed. Her pride was still wounded, her anger still burning beneath the surface. When Thoth finally began to speak directly about Egypt and the suffering her absence had caused, her initial reaction was dismissive. Why should she care about the land that had driven her away? Why should she concern herself with the people who had allowed her father to treat her so poorly? This was the crucial moment of the negotiation. Thoth realized that appealing to Tefnut's compassion alone would not be sufficient. He needed to help her understand that her exile was hurting her as much as it was hurting Egypt. Her true nature as a goddess of life and moisture was being corrupted by her isolation and anger. She was becoming something she had never intended to be, a force of pure destruction. So Thoth began to tell her a different kind of story, the story of herself. He reminded her of her birth from the breath of the Creator God, of her essential role in the cosmic order. He spoke of the joy she had once found in bringing rain to thirsty fields, of the satisfaction she had felt when her tears of compassion had eased human suffering. He reminded her of her relationship with Shu, of how their love had created the perfect balance between moisture and dryness that allowed life to flourish. He painted a picture of how incomplete the cosmos had become without her presence, how even her brother, mighty as he was, could not maintain the atmospheric balance alone. And gradually, as Thoth spoke, Tefnut began to remember who she truly was. The rage that had consumed her for so long began to seem foreign, like a fever that had finally broken. She began to see her exile not as a justified rebellion, but as a self-imposed prison that had cut her off from everything that gave her life meaning. But even as her heart began to soften, her pride remained a barrier. She had made such dramatic declarations when she left Egypt, had rejected her father's authority so completely. How could she return without losing face? How could she admit that her anger had been wrong without undermining her own divine dignity? It was Shu who provided the solution to this dilemma. Speaking for the first time since their encounter began, he offered his sister a way to return that would preserve her honor. He suggested that her exile had served an important purpose. It had shown both gods and mortals how essential she was to the proper functioning of the world. Her absence had taught everyone, including Ra himself, to properly value her contributions. In this light, her return would not be a surrender but a victory. She would come back not as a chastened child accepting punishment, but as a goddess whose importance had been dramatically demonstrated. Egypt's suffering had proved beyond any doubt that she was not a minor deity to be taken for granted, but a crucial force in the cosmic order. This reframing of the situation was exactly what Tefnut needed to hear. It allowed her to consider returning home without feeling that she was betraying her own principles or admitting complete defeat. She could maintain her dignity while also answering the call of her true nature. But the transformation was not immediate. Even as Tefnut began to consider Thoth's words, her lioness form remained fierce and dangerous. The anger and pain of her exile had changed her on a fundamental level, and it would take time and effort to heal those wounds. The three deities spent several days at the oasis, engaged in long conversations that gradually rebuilt the trust and affection that had been damaged by the family conflict. Thoth shared news from Egypt, careful to balance reports of the people's suffering with stories of their enduring faith and hope. Shu spoke of his own loneliness during their separation, of how the world had felt incomplete without his beloved sister. Slowly, carefully, they began the process of Tefnut's emotional and spiritual healing. The rage that had sustained her through her exile began to drain away, replaced by a growing desire to return to her proper role in the cosmic order. The lioness form that had terrified the Nubian desert began to seem constraining rather than empowering. And finally, on a morning when the desert sun rose clear and bright over the oasis, Tefnut made her decision. She would return to Egypt. She would resume her role as the goddess of moisture and rain. She would take her place once again as the Eye of Ra, serving as both protector and enforcer of the divine order. But this return would not be a quiet, secretive affair. Tefnut had learned something important during her exile. Her power and importance needed to be publicly recognized and celebrated. The people of Egypt needed to understand exactly what they had lost when she left and what they were gaining with her return. So began one of the most spectacular processions in all mythology. Tefnut, gradually transforming from her terrifying lioness form back into her beautiful divine appearance, began the journey north toward Egypt. But she did not travel alone or in humble secrecy. Instead, she gathered around her a great caravan of celebration. The Nubian people, who had lived in terror of the demon lioness, were amazed and delighted to discover that their tormentor had been transformed into a benevolent goddess. They joined her procession with music and dancing, grateful for their deliverance and eager to honor the deity who was bringing the promise of rain back to the world. Musicians appeared with drums and flutes, filling the desert air with rhythms that seemed to call the very clouds down from the sky. Dancers moved in patterns that mimicked the flow of water and the movement of wind. Acrobats and performers of all kinds joined the growing celebration, creating a festival atmosphere that grew more elaborate with each mile of the journey. But the most remarkable aspect of the procession was what happened to the landscape itself as Tefnut passed through it. The desert oases that had been destroyed during her rage began to bloom again. Springs that had been poisoned or dried up suddenly flowed with fresh, sweet water. Palm trees that had been reduced to charred stumps put forth new green shoots. The very air began to feel different, moister, more breathable, full of the promise of rain. As word of Tefnut's return spread ahead of the procession, people began to gather along the route. At first, these were mostly Nubians who had heard the news from other travelers. But as the caravan moved north toward the Egyptian border, Egyptian refugees who had fled south to escape the drought began to join the crowds. The sight of these displaced people, their own subjects and worshippers, had a profound effect on Tefnut. She saw the consequences of her actions written in their haggard faces, their tattered clothes, their desperate hope. These were not abstract statistics of suffering, but real people whose lives had been devastated by her absence. The guilt and remorse she felt were overwhelming, but they were also transformative. Every tear she shed for the people she had unintentionally harmed fell to the earth as blessed rain. Every sigh of regret she breathed became a cool, moisture-laden breeze that brought relief from the desert heat. And as Tefnut wept and sighed, the desert itself began to respond. Clouds gathered on the horizon for the first time in years. The air grew heavy with the promise of rain. Plants that had been dormant during the long drought began to send up green shoots from the moistened earth. By the time the procession reached the border between Nubia and Egypt, it had become a massive celebration involving thousands of people. The sound of music and singing could be heard for miles in every direction. The sight of the goddess herself, now fully transformed from the terrifying lioness into her beautiful divine form, filled everyone who saw her with wonder and joy. But the most amazing sight of all was what had happened to the Nile River. As Tefnut approached its banks, the water level began to rise. At first it was just a few inches, barely noticeable except to those who had been watching the river's decline with desperate attention. But as the goddess drew closer, the rise became more dramatic. By the time Tefnut actually set foot on Egyptian soil for the first time in years, the Nile was flowing at levels not seen since before the drought began. The current was strong and swift, carrying the rich silt that would fertilize the fields. The sound of rushing water, absent for so long, filled the air like music. As news of Tefnut's return spread throughout Egypt, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. In villages and cities throughout the land, people poured out of their homes to witness the miracle they had prayed for so desperately. Temples that had been closed due to lack of water reopened their doors. Priests who had performed empty rituals in dry sanctuaries suddenly found their altars overflowing with sacred water. The procession up the Nile became a triumphal parade that grew larger and more elaborate with each city it passed. Local rulers joined the celebration, bringing their own musicians and dancers. Ordinary people contributed whatever they could: flowers to strew in the goddess's path, incense to sweeten the air, songs and poetry to honor her return. But perhaps the most moving moments came when Tefnut encountered the people who had suffered most during her absence. When she saw the farmers standing in fields that had been reduced to cracked earth and dead stalks, she wept openly. Her tears fell as gentle rain, immediately beginning the process of restoring the devastated landscape. When she met the mothers who had lost children to the drought and famine, she embraced them with a compassion that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. The moisture from her skin seemed to carry healing properties, easing the deep dehydration that had weakened so many during the crisis. Honestly, which aspect of divine mercy do you find most comforting? For me, it has to be the idea that even cosmic forces can feel genuine remorse and work to make amends. There's something deeply reassuring about that possibility. As the procession continued north toward Memphis and the great temples of Heliopolis where Ra held court, Tefnut found herself transformed once again. The anger and pride that had driven her into exile were completely gone, replaced by a deep sense of responsibility and love for the land and people she served. She began to understand her role not as a burden imposed by her father, but as a sacred trust that connected her to every living thing in Egypt. Every plant that needed water to grow, every animal that required moisture to survive, every human being who depended on the annual flood. All of them were part of her divine family, deserving of her care and protection. When the procession finally reached Memphis, the capital of Egypt, the celebration reached its climax. The pharaoh himself came out to greet the returning goddess, acknowledging her crucial importance to the kingdom's survival. The greatest priests and nobles of the land joined in ceremonies of welcome and thanksgiving that lasted for days. But the most important reunion was yet to come. As Tefnut approached the great temple complex of Heliopolis, where her father Ra maintained his primary residence on earth, she felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that surprised her with its intensity. How would her father receive her after their bitter quarrel? Would he be angry about the devastation her absence had caused? Would he welcome her back, or would there be conditions and punishments? As it turned out, Ra's reaction was everything Tefnut could have hoped for, and more. The moment he saw his daughter approaching the temple, he rushed out to meet her, his face shining with joy and relief. There were no recriminations, no lectures about responsibility, no demands for apologies. There was only a father's overwhelming happiness at having his beloved child safely home. The embrace between Ra and Tefnut was witnessed by thousands of people, and many said later that it was like watching the sun itself embrace a cloud heavy with rain. The very air around them seemed to shimmer with divine energy, and a gentle shower fell from a clear sky, blessing everyone present with the touch of sacred water. In that moment of reconciliation, both father and daughter understood something important that had been lost in their earlier conflict. Their relationship was not a matter of authority and obedience, but of mutual love and respect. Ra valued Tefnut not just for her divine duties, but for who she was as his daughter. And Tefnut served not out of compulsion, but out of love for her father and for the creation they had built together. The ceremony celebrating Tefnut's return lasted for a full month, with festivals and processions in every major city in Egypt. But the real celebration was taking place in the natural world itself. The Nile continued to rise until it reached perfect flood levels, covering the fields with the life-giving silt that would ensure abundant harvests. Rain fell regularly but gently, soaking deep into the earth without causing destructive floods. The desert itself seemed to rejoice in Tefnut's return. Oases that had been dry for years suddenly bloomed with date palms and acacia trees. Wells that had been abandoned refilled with sweet, clear water. Even the harsh regions far from the Nile began to show signs of renewed life as moisture returned to the air. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in Tefnut herself. Her exile and return had taught her valuable lessons about the interconnectedness of all life. She understood now that her role as the Eye of Ra was not about enforcing her father's will through fear, but about maintaining the delicate balance that allowed all creatures to thrive. She became more attentive to the needs of ordinary people, more careful about the timing and intensity of the rains she brought. She learned to work more closely with her brother Shu, coordinating moisture and air pressure to create the perfect conditions for agriculture. Her tears, once shed in anger or sorrow, now fell as gentle dew that nourished the smallest plants and provided drink for the tiniest creatures. As the years passed and Egypt flourished under the restored cosmic balance, the story of Tefnut's exile and return became one of the most beloved myths in Egyptian culture. It was told and retold in many versions, each emphasizing different aspects of the great drama. Some versions focused on the environmental catastrophe and recovery, using the story to explain the natural cycles of drought and abundance that periodically affected the Nile Valley. These tellings emphasized the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the gods through ritual and offering. Other versions concentrated on the family drama between Ra and Tefnut, using their conflict and reconciliation as a model for human relationships. These stories taught that even the deepest anger could be healed through patience, wisdom, and genuine love. Still other versions highlighted the diplomatic mission of Thoth and Shu, celebrating the power of words and wisdom to resolve conflicts that might otherwise lead to destruction. These tales emphasized the importance of skilled negotiation and the value of understanding different perspectives. But all versions of the story agreed on its central message. The goddess Tefnut had indeed saved Egypt, not through conquest or force, but through her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes, heal her relationships, and return to her proper role in the cosmic order. In the great libraries of the temples, scribes recorded every detail of these events, ensuring that future generations would remember the lessons learned during the time of the great drought. The story became part of the education of every young priest and priestess, teaching them about the delicate balance required to maintain cosmic harmony. Artists and craftsmen throughout Egypt created beautiful representations of Tefnut's return. Temple walls were decorated with scenes of the great procession up the Nile. Jewelry and amulets were crafted in the shape of lionesses and rain clouds, serving as reminders of the goddess's protection. Poems and songs celebrating her mercy and power became part of the standard repertoire of court musicians. The annual flood of the Nile came to be seen as a renewal of Tefnut's promise to Egypt. Each year, as the waters rose and spread across the fields, people remembered the dark time when the river had remained low and the land had suffered. They understood that the abundance they enjoyed was not guaranteed, but depended on maintaining proper relationships with the divine forces that controlled their world. Farmers developing new irrigation techniques would invoke Tefnut's blessing, asking for her guidance in managing water resources wisely. Mothers teaching their children about the importance of conservation would tell them stories of the great drought, helping them understand that even the most basic necessities of life were gifts to be treasured and protected. The priests in the temples developed new rituals specifically designed to honor Tefnut and maintain her favor. These ceremonies emphasized gratitude for the gift of water, respect for the power of natural forces, and the importance of humility in the face of divine authority. They served as regular reminders that human prosperity depended on cosmic harmony. During times of political turmoil or environmental stress, Egyptian leaders would often invoke the story of Tefnut's return as a source of hope and guidance. If the gods themselves could overcome their differences and restore broken relationships, then surely human conflicts could also be resolved through patience and wisdom. The story also influenced Egyptian attitudes toward neighboring peoples, particularly the Nubians to the south. Instead of seeing Nubia simply as a source of gold and exotic goods, many Egyptians came to understand it as the land that had sheltered their goddess during her time of exile. This perspective fostered greater respect for Nubian culture and traditions. Think about how profoundly a single story can shape an entire civilization's worldview. Which myths or stories from your own culture do you think have had the most lasting impact? For me, it has to be the stories that teach us about forgiveness and redemption. They seem to speak to something fundamental in human nature. As centuries passed and Egypt faced new challenges, invasions by foreign armies, changes in climate, shifts in political power, the story of Tefnut's exile and return remained a constant source of inspiration and guidance. It reminded people that even the darkest times could lead to renewal and growth, that conflicts within families and communities could be healed through understanding and compassion. The goddess herself continued to play an active role in Egyptian religion throughout the long history of the civilization. During the New Kingdom period, when Egyptian armies marched south into Nubia, soldiers would pray to Tefnut for protection, remembering that she had once made her home in those distant lands. During the later periods of Egyptian history, when foreign rulers conquered the land, people found comfort in the knowledge that their gods had faced and overcome similar challenges. Even when Christianity and Islam eventually replaced the ancient Egyptian religion, elements of Tefnut's story survived in folklore and popular tradition. Stories of powerful female figures who controlled rain and fertility, who could be both nurturing and terrifyingly destructive, continued to be told along the Nile Valley. The deep human need to understand and relate to the natural forces that controlled agricultural prosperity ensured that some version of her story would always remain relevant. In the great museums of the world today, you can still see artifacts from ancient Egypt that depict Tefnut in her various forms. Stone reliefs show her as a lioness goddess crowned with the solar disk, her powerful form both beautiful and intimidating. Papyrus scrolls contain hymns and prayers addressed to her, asking for rain in times of drought and expressing gratitude during times of abundance. These ancient objects serve as tangible connections to a time when humans felt a direct, personal relationship with the forces of nature. They remind us that our ancestors understood something important about the interconnectedness of all life, about the delicate balance required to maintain a thriving civilization. The story of Tefnut's exile and return also speaks to timeless themes that remain relevant in our modern world. The tension between individual autonomy and collective responsibility, the challenge of healing damaged relationships, the importance of acknowledging our mistakes and working to make amends, these are issues that every generation must grapple with in their own way. Perhaps most importantly, Tefnut's story reminds us that even the most devastating crises can contain the seeds of renewal and growth. The great drought that nearly destroyed Egypt ultimately led to a deeper understanding of the goddess's importance and a more balanced relationship between divine and human concerns. The suffering caused by her absence became the foundation for a more sustainable and harmonious approach to managing natural resources. As we face our own environmental challenges in the modern world, there is something both humbling and inspiring about this ancient story. It suggests that humans have always struggled to understand and properly relate to the natural forces that sustain life. It reminds us that our relationship with the environment is not just a matter of technology and policy, but also involves deeper questions of respect, gratitude, and responsibility. The goddess Tefnut may no longer be worshipped in temples along the Nile, but her story continues to offer valuable insights for anyone seeking to understand the complex relationship between human civilization and the natural world. It teaches us that we ignore these relationships at our peril, but also that it is never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and work toward healing and restoration. But to truly understand the profound impact of Tefnut's story, we must dive deeper into the world she inhabited and the forces she controlled. Let us explore the sacred element that defined her very essence, water itself, and its absolutely crucial role in the civilization that worshipped her. In ancient Egypt, water was not merely a necessity for survival. It was the fundamental force that separated civilization from chaos, life from death, abundance from desolation. The ancient Egyptians understood this relationship with a clarity that might seem almost mystical to our modern minds, but which was born from thousands of years of intimate dependence on the rhythms of river and rain. The Nile River was more than just a waterway cutting through the desert. It was the lifeblood of an entire civilization, the divine serpent whose movements determined whether millions of people would feast or starve. Every morning, as Ra's sunboat sailed across the sky, Egyptian farmers would walk to the river's edge to check its level, reading the water like a sacred text that foretold their future. The annual flood, which Egyptians called the inundation, was timed with astronomical precision that still amazes modern scientists. Beginning around mid-July, the waters would start to rise, reaching their peak in September before gradually receding through October and November. This wasn't just a natural phenomenon, it was a cosmic event that required careful observation, preparation, and spiritual engagement. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile in late June, watching for the first signs that the waters were beginning to stir. The river would be at its lowest point, revealing sandbanks and mudflats that had been hidden for months. Fishermen would wade into the shallow pools, gathering the last harvest from waters that would soon be transformed into a rushing torrent. Farmers would make final preparations to their fields, reinforcing the dikes and channels that would direct the floodwaters exactly where they were needed. But this wasn't merely a matter of practical engineering. Every aspect of the flood was understood to be under divine control, requiring constant communication with the gods through ritual, offering, and prayer. Temples throughout Egypt maintained detailed records of flood levels going back centuries, correlating the height of the waters with the success of harvests and the stability of the kingdom. The priests who served Tefnut understood that their goddess controlled not just the moisture in the air, but the very timing and intensity of this life-giving flood. They developed elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure her favor during the crucial months when Egypt's survival hung in the balance. These rituals began months before the flood season, with processions and offerings designed to awaken Tefnut's attention and encourage her benevolence. In the temple complexes dedicated to the goddess, sacred pools were maintained year-round as symbols of the cosmic waters she controlled. These pools were filled with Nile water during the flood season and carefully preserved throughout the dry months. Priests would perform daily ablutions in these sacred waters, symbolically connecting themselves to Tefnut's divine essence. The water used in these temples wasn't just ordinary river water, it was carefully collected at specific times and locations according to ancient formulas. The most sacred water came from the very first moment of the annual flood, captured in golden vessels as it began to rise above its lowest point. This first water was considered to contain the concentrated essence of Tefnut's returning power. During the height of the flood season, when the Nile spread across the valley floor like a vast inland sea, Egyptians would celebrate with festivals that combined religious devotion with practical thanksgiving. Boats decorated with lotus flowers and carrying offerings of bread, beer, and incense would sail across the flooded fields. Musicians would play hymns of gratitude to Tefnut, while dancers moved in patterns that mimicked the flow of water and the growth of plants. These celebrations weren't superficial displays of joy, they represented a deep understanding of humanity's dependence on forces beyond their control. Every Egyptian, from the pharaoh to the humblest farmer, knew that their prosperity was entirely dependent on Tefnut's willingness to provide the moisture that sustained their world. The goddess's tears, as the ancient texts described rain and dew, were considered to have healing properties. Water that fell during thunderstorms was collected in special vessels and used in medical treatments. Morning dew was gathered before sunrise and used in cosmetics and medicines, believed to carry the rejuvenating power of Tefnut's compassion. But water in Egypt wasn't just about the annual flood. The complex network of canals, reservoirs, and irrigation channels that distributed water throughout the valley required constant maintenance and careful management. This infrastructure was understood to be under Tefnut's protection, and workers who maintained it would perform ritual purifications before beginning their tasks. The shadoof, that elegant counterweight system used to lift water from the river to higher fields, was considered a sacred tool blessed by the goddess. Farmers would decorate their shadows with offerings and perform daily rituals before using them, acknowledging that even their human engineering was dependent on divine favor. Wells and springs throughout Egypt were seen as places where Tefnut's power touched the earth directly. These water sources often became sites of pilgrimage and worship, with small shrines built around them where travelers could leave offerings and pray for the goddess's protection. The water from these sacred wells was believed to have special properties, capable of curing illnesses and bringing good fortune. During times of drought, when Tefnut's absence was felt most keenly, Egyptians would gather at these wells and springs for special ceremonies of supplication. They would pour libations of precious beer and wine into the water, symbolically offering their most valuable liquids to encourage the goddess to return with her life-giving moisture. The relationship between water and fertility was understood not just in agricultural terms, but in human reproduction as well. Pregnant women would bathe in water blessed by Tefnut's priests, believing that this would ensure easy childbirth and healthy babies. Newborn children were baptized with sacred water, formally introducing them to the goddess who would watch over their lives. What do you think would be the most challenging aspect of living in complete dependence on natural water cycles? For me, it would be the constant awareness that forces beyond my control determine whether I eat or starve. That level of vulnerability would require tremendous faith and community solidarity. But Egypt's relationship with water wasn't just about survival, it was about understanding the delicate balance that made their extraordinary civilization possible. They lived at the intersection of the life-giving Nile and the life-taking desert, and this positioning taught them profound lessons about the importance of maintaining harmony with natural forces. The desert, which the Egyptians called the Red Land, served as a constant reminder of what their world would become without Tefnut's blessing. Just a few miles from the green abundance of the Nile Valley, travelers could find themselves in landscapes so harsh and dry that survival became a matter of hours rather than days. This proximity to desolation made Egyptians deeply grateful for the water that sustained their civilization. Desert storms, with their howling winds and stinging sand, were understood to be manifestations of cosmic forces temporarily out of balance. When such storms arose, Egyptians would huddle in their homes and pray to Tefnut to restore the proper relationship between moisture and dryness. They understood that their comfortable world existed only through the goddess's constant vigilance and care. The contrast between the black land of the fertile valley and the red land of the desert became a fundamental metaphor in Egyptian thought. The black land represented order, fertility, and divine blessing. The red land represented chaos, sterility, and divine abandonment. Tefnut's role was to maintain the boundary between these two realms, ensuring that life could flourish in the narrow green corridor along the river. This understanding extended to their beliefs about the afterlife as well. The journey through death was often described as a passage through desert landscapes where the deceased soul would face the same challenges of thirst and desolation that threatened living travelers. Only those who had properly honored Tefnut and the other water deities would be provided with the spiritual sustenance needed to reach the blessed realm of eternal life. Egyptian art and literature are filled with images that celebrate the life-giving properties of water. Tomb paintings show the deceased enjoying eternal banquets beside flowing streams. Love poetry compares beautiful women to fresh springs and flowing rivers. Religious hymns describe the voices of the gods as the sound of rushing water bringing joy to parched lands. The hieroglyphic writing system itself incorporated water symbolism in fundamental ways. The symbol for water, 3 wavy lines, appeared in hundreds of words related to life, purity, and divine blessing. The act of writing itself was sometimes described as channeling the flow of divine knowledge, like water flowing through carefully prepared channels. As we delve deeper into this aquatic world that Tefnut ruled, we begin to understand that her story was part of a much larger network of divine feminine power that sustained Egyptian civilization. She was not an isolated goddess ruling over a single element, but rather one member of a complex sisterhood of female deities who together maintained the cosmic balance that made life possible. Let us turn our attention now to these other goddesses and explore how their powers complemented and enhanced Tefnut's dominion over moisture and rain. In the rich pantheon of Egyptian deities, female gods held positions of extraordinary power and respect, embodying the creative and sustaining forces that kept the universe functioning properly. Nut, the sky goddess, arched her star-spangled body over the earth each night, creating the celestial dome that protected all life below. But her relationship with Tefnut was more complex than simple coexistence. As the goddess of the sky, Nut was the realm through which Tefnut's rain clouds travelled. The two goddesses worked together to determine when and where precipitation would fall, with Nut providing the vast canvas across which Tefnut painted her moisture-laden masterpieces. The ancient texts describe intimate conversations between these sister goddesses, planning the weather patterns that would best serve the needs of the land below. When storms were needed to break prolonged droughts, Nut would darken her celestial skin to create the heavy clouds that Tefnut would fill with rain. When gentle, steady rainfall was required to nurture growing crops, Nut would maintain a lighter, more translucent appearance that allowed Tefnut's moisture to fall as mist and light showers. During the flood season, the collaboration between Nut and Tefnut became particularly visible to human observers. The night sky during these months would often be filled with dramatic cloud formations that seemed to dance and swirl in patterns that suggested divine choreography. Egyptians would gather on rooftops and temple courtyards to watch these celestial displays, understanding them as visible proof of the goddess's active involvement in their world. But perhaps the most intimate relationship Tefnut shared was with Hathor, the goddess of love, joy, and beauty. While this might seem like an unlikely partnership, what does moisture have to do with romance? The ancient Egyptians understood profound connections between these domains. Love, like water, was seen as a life-giving force that could transform barren landscapes into gardens of delight. Hathor was often depicted as a cow goddess, and the connection to Tefnut becomes clear when we remember that cattle were among the most valuable possessions in ancient Egypt precisely because they required abundant water and green pasture. A land blessed by Tefnut's rains could support large herds of cattle, which in turn provided milk, meat, and leather that enhanced human life. Prosperity, love, and fertility were all interconnected through the fundamental blessing of adequate water. The festivals celebrating these two goddesses often overlapped, with celebrations of love and beauty taking place during the seasons when Tefnut's rains had made the land green and beautiful. Young couples would meet at riverside festivals, understanding that their romantic happiness was blessed and sustained by the same divine forces that brought fertility to the fields. Hathor's role as protector of women in childbirth also connected her closely to Tefnut's domain. The waters that broke to signal the beginning of labour were understood to be under both goddesses' protection. Midwives would invoke both deities during difficult births, asking Hathor to ease the mother's pain while petitioning Tefnut to provide the life-giving fluids that would sustain both mother and child. The temples dedicated to Hathor often featured elaborate water features, pools, fountains, and channels that created the sound of flowing water throughout the sacred complex. These weren't merely decorative elements but were designed to honor Tefnut's contribution to the love and joy that Hathor represented. Visitors to these temples would hear the constant murmur of moving water, reminding them that even the most refined human pleasures depended on the fundamental blessing of adequate moisture. But it was with Isis, the great goddess of magic and motherhood, that Tefnut shared perhaps her most profound and complex relationship. Isis represented the power of divine feminine wisdom to heal, protect, and restore life even in the face of terrible tragedy. Her famous story of reassembling her murdered husband Osiris and breathing life back into his scattered remains demonstrated the ultimate power of love to overcome death itself. Tefnut's tears, which brought rain to the earth, were often compared to the tears Isis shed while mourning Osiris. Both goddesses understood that sometimes the most powerful creation comes from the deepest sorrow, that the waters of grief can become the waters of renewal. This connection gave special meaning to Tefnut's own exile, and return her journey mirrored the cycle of death and resurrection that Isis had pioneered. During the annual ceremonies commemorating Osiris's resurrection, water played a crucial symbolic role. Sacred pools were filled with Nile water mixed with the tears of mourning women, creating a potent blend that represented both sorrow and hope. Tefnut's priests would bless these waters, understanding that the goddess's own experience of loss and restoration gave her special power to sanctify the cycles of death and rebirth. The magic that Isis wielded often involved the transformation of water from one state to another. She could turn ordinary river water into healing potions, transform tears into precious gems, change destructive floods into gentle, nourishing streams. These magical transformations were understood to be performed in partnership with Tefnut, whose dominion over all forms of moisture gave her the power to alter water's essential properties. Mothers throughout Egypt would pray to both goddesses when their children fell ill, understanding that healing required both Isis's magical knowledge and Tefnut's power over the bodily fluids that sustained life. The practice of using blessed water in medical treatments combined both goddesses' spheres of influence, creating remedies that addressed both physical symptoms and spiritual imbalance. Which relationship between goddesses do you find most fascinating? For me, it has to be the partnership between grief and renewal that Tefnut and Isis represented. The idea that our deepest sorrows can become sources of life-giving power. That's a profoundly hopeful perspective. These divine relationships weren't just abstract theological concepts. They had practical implications for how Egyptians understood and managed their world. The interconnectedness of the goddesses taught that no aspect of life existed in isolation, that fertility, love, wisdom, and natural abundance were all part of a complex web of relationships that required careful attention and respect. This understanding becomes even more significant when we consider that Tefnut's story of exile and return wasn't unique in Egyptian mythology. The pattern of divine separation followed by reconciliation and renewal appears repeatedly in their sacred stories, suggesting that the ancient Egyptians recognized this cycle as a fundamental aspect of how the universe maintains its balance. The separation of Nut and Geb, earth and sky, provides perhaps the most dramatic parallel to Tefnut's story. These two gods, as we mentioned earlier, fell so deeply in love that they locked themselves in an eternal embrace, making it impossible for life to exist between them. Their separation, enforced by Shu's intervention, created the space necessary for rivers to flow, plants to grow, and creatures to live and breathe. But this separation wasn't portrayed as a tragedy, it was understood as a necessary sacrifice that made all other life possible. Nut and Geb's love didn't disappear when they were separated. Instead, it was transformed into a different kind of relationship that sustained rather than smothered the life between them. Their story taught Egyptians that sometimes love requires distance, that the most profound relationships aren't always the most intimate ones. During certain times of the year, when atmospheric conditions created unusual cloud formations or lighting effects, Egyptians would say that Nut and Geb were reaching toward each other across the vast space that separated them. These moments were seen as reminders that their separation was willing and purposeful, not a punishment but a gift to all the life they had made possible through their sacrifice. The annual cycle of planting and harvest was understood to reflect this divine relationship. When farmers planted seeds in the earth, they were participating in the ongoing love story between Geb and Nut. The seeds represented messages of love sent from earth to sky, while the rain that nourished them represented the sky's loving response. Tefnut's role in this cosmic romance was to carry these messages of love back and forth between the separated lovers. Another powerful example of divine separation and reconciliation appears in the story of Hathor's own exile. In some versions of Egyptian mythology, Hathor becomes so angry with humanity's ingratitude and violence that she transforms into Sekhmet, a terrifying lioness goddess who begins systematically destroying human civilization. Like Tefnut, she flees to the distant deserts where her rage can burn without constraint. The parallels between these two stories are striking. Both goddesses transform into lioness forms when consumed by anger. Both retreat to the harsh desert regions where their fury can rage without immediate consequences for Egypt. Both require careful diplomatic intervention to convince them to return to their proper roles in the cosmic order. But there are also important differences that illuminate different aspects of divine psychology. While Tefnut's anger was primarily directed at her father and the cosmic order itself, Hathor's rage focused on humanity's moral failures. Her exile wasn't a family dispute, but a response to the breakdown of ethical behavior in human society. The solution to Hathor's rage required a different approach than Thoth's diplomatic mission to Tefnut. Instead of reasoned argument and emotional appeal, Hathor was lured back to civilization through a clever trick involving vast quantities of beer mixed with red ochre to resemble blood. When the bloodthirsty goddess drank what she thought was the blood of her victims, she became intoxicated and fell into a deep sleep. Upon awakening, her rage had dissipated, and she returned to her benevolent nature as the goddess of love and joy. This story taught Egyptians that different types of divine anger required different approaches to resolution. Some conflicts, like Tefnut's, could be resolved through understanding and communication. Others, like Hathor's, required more indirect methods that addressed the underlying emotional imbalance rather than the surface grievances. The cyclical nature of these stories reflects a deep understanding of natural processes that we can see throughout Egyptian culture. They recognized that conflict and resolution, separation and reunion, destruction and renewal were all necessary parts of maintaining cosmic balance. Just as the Nile flooded and receded in annual cycles, divine relationships went through periods of harmony and discord that ultimately served the greater good. These patterns weren't limited to Egyptian mythology. When we expand our view to examine water symbolism in other ancient cultures, we find remarkably similar themes and understanding. The recognition of water as a fundamental life force, the association of water deities with both creation and destruction, the understanding of drought as divine displeasure. These concepts appear in mythological systems around the world. In Greek mythology, Poseidon ruled the seas with the same combination of nurturing provision and terrifying power that characterized Tefnut's dominion over moisture. Like the Egyptian goddess, Poseidon could provide the water necessary for life and trade, but he could also unleash devastating storms and floods when angered or disrespected. Greek sailors would perform elaborate rituals before embarking on sea voyages, understanding that their survival depended on maintaining proper relationships with the forces that controlled the waters. The Greek nymphs, spirits of springs, rivers and streams, served functions similar to Tefnut's role in Egyptian religion. These feminine water spirits were understood to be the divine essence present in every source of fresh water. They required respect and proper offerings to ensure that wells didn't run dry, that rivers continued to flow clearly, that springs maintained their healing properties. But perhaps the most striking parallel appears in the Greek story of Demeter's withdrawal from the world following the abduction of her daughter Persephone. Like Tefnut, Demeter was a goddess whose emotions directly affected the natural world. When her grief and anger consumed her, all vegetation on earth withered and died, creating a devastating famine that threatened to destroy all life. The resolution of Demeter's crisis, like Tefnut's, required diplomatic intervention and compromise. Zeus, the king of the gods, had to negotiate a complex arrangement that allowed Persephone to spend part of each year with her mother and part with her husband in the underworld. This compromise created the seasonal cycle that Greeks used to explain why some parts of the year were fertile and abundant, while others were barren and cold. The parallels between these stories suggest that ancient peoples around the Mediterranean world recognized similar patterns in their relationships with natural forces. The understanding that divine emotions could directly affect human welfare, that maintaining proper relationships with these forces required constant attention and respect, that conflicts could be resolved through wisdom and compromise. These insights appear in culture after culture. Norse mythology provides another fascinating perspective on water symbolism and divine relationships. The Well of Erd, one of 3 sacred wells beneath the world tree Yggdrasil, was tended by the Norns, 3 goddesses who controlled fate and destiny. This well contained the waters of wisdom and prophecy, and even Odin, the chief of the gods, had to sacrifice his eye to drink from it and gain the knowledge he needed to prevent the end of the world. The Norse understanding of water as a source of wisdom and prophecy resonates strongly with Egyptian beliefs about Tefnut's tears carrying divine knowledge. Both cultures recognized that water could be a medium through which divine intelligence flowed into the world, making it accessible to those who approached it with proper respect and preparation. The Rainbow Bridge, Bifrost, which connected the realm of the gods to the world of humans in Norse cosmology, was understood to be made of water vapor and light. Essentially, a divine manifestation of the same atmospheric moisture that Tefnut controlled. This bridge served as a pathway for communication between divine and mortal realms, suggesting that water in its various forms served as a medium for spiritual connection. Native American traditions from across North America offer perhaps the most profound parallels to Egyptian water mythology. Countless tribes have stories of rainmakers, water spirits, and sacred beings who control precipitation and river flows. These stories often involve themes of respect, reciprocity, and the consequences of taking natural abundance for granted. The Hopi tradition of the Kachinas, spirit beings who bring rain and fertility to the desert southwest, mirrors many aspects of Tefnut's role in Egyptian religion. Like the Egyptian goddess, the Kachinas require proper ceremonies and offerings to ensure that they continue to bless the land with life-giving moisture. The elaborate Kachina dances performed throughout the year serve functions similar to the festivals that honored Tefnut along the Nile. Cherokee stories tell of water spirits who can withdraw their blessing from communities that fail to show proper respect for rivers and streams. These spirits, like Tefnut, can appear as both nurturing providers and terrifying avengers depending on how humans treat the natural world they inhabit. The Lakota understanding of water as sacred, as the first medicine that makes all other life possible, echoes the Egyptian recognition of water as the fundamental creative force. In both traditions, water ceremonies play central roles in healing, spiritual purification, and community renewal. What strikes me most about these cross-cultural parallels is how consistently water appears as both a blessing and a responsibility. Which aspect of water's dual nature, life-giving or potentially destructive, do you think ancient peoples found more significant? For me, it would be the life-giving aspect, because that's what makes all other concerns possible in the first place. This global recognition of water's spiritual significance helps us understand why Thoth's role as mediator was so crucial to resolving Tefnut's crisis. In mythological traditions around the world, successful communication with water deities requires special wisdom, patience, and diplomatic skill. These aren't forces that can be controlled through simple commands or threatened into compliance. They must be approached with the kind of sophisticated understanding that Thoth represented. In Egyptian mythology, Thoth's wisdom wasn't just intellectual knowledge, it was a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. As the god of writing and record-keeping, he maintained the cosmic archives that documented the relationships between all divine beings. He understood how each god's actions affected all the others, how individual conflicts could disrupt the entire cosmic order. This comprehensive perspective made Thoth uniquely qualified to serve as mediator in divine disputes. He could see past the immediate causes of conflict to understand the deeper imbalances that needed to be addressed. In Tefnut's case, he recognized that her anger wasn't really about her specific disagreement with Ra, but about feeling undervalued and taken for granted in her crucial role, maintaining cosmic balance. Thoth's diplomatic missions throughout Egyptian mythology follow remarkably consistent patterns. He rarely attempts to resolve conflicts through force or authority. Instead, he relies on storytelling, reasoned argument, and appeals to the deeper nature and true interests of the disputing parties. His approach recognizes that lasting solutions must address not just the surface disagreements, but the underlying emotional and spiritual needs that drive divine behavior. The god's role as inventor of writing gives additional depth to his mediation abilities. In Egyptian thought, writing wasn't just a method of record-keeping, it was a form of magic that could create new realities through the power of precisely chosen words. When Thoth spoke to angry deities, he was literally writing new stories about their relationships, creating linguistic frameworks that made reconciliation possible. This understanding of language as creative force appears throughout Egyptian culture. The power of divine words to shape reality meant that diplomatic speech wasn't just persuasion, it was a form of cosmic engineering that could rebuild damaged relationships and restore broken harmonies. Thoth's wisdom included knowing exactly which words would resonate with each deity's essential nature. His success with Tefnut demonstrates this linguistic mastery perfectly. Rather than beginning with demands or accusations, he approached her through stories that gradually awakened her memories of who she truly was beneath her anger. He reminded her of her cosmic importance, not to make her feel guilty about her absence, but to help her remember the joy she had once found in fulfilling her divine purpose. The ibis form that Thoth often assumed also carries deep symbolic meaning related to his mediation role. Ibises are wading birds that feed in the shallow waters along riverbanks. They exist at the boundary between land and water, making them perfect symbols for a deity who specialized in bridging different realms and perspectives. Their long, curved beaks allow them to probe deeply beneath the surface of muddy waters, much as Thoth's wisdom allowed him to discover the hidden causes of divine conflicts. Throughout Egyptian history, priests who served as mediators and counselors would invoke Thoth's guidance before attempting to resolve disputes. They understood that successful mediation required more than just practical negotiation skills. It demanded the kind of divine wisdom that could perceive the sacred patterns underlying all relationships. The god's association with the moon also connected him to the natural cycles of renewal and restoration that made reconciliation possible. Just as the moon waxed and waned in regular patterns, Thoth understood that conflicts and their resolutions followed predictable rhythms. His timing in approaching Tefnut wasn't random. He waited for the moment when her anger had begun to transform into loneliness, when she was psychologically ready to consider alternatives to her exile. This sophisticated understanding of divine psychology appears in many of Thoth's mythological interventions. He seems to have possessed an almost therapeutic understanding of how to help other deities work through their emotional crises and rediscover their capacity for healthy relationships. His approach combined practical wisdom with deep compassion, creating the conditions necessary for genuine healing and growth. The lessons embedded in these stories weren't just relevant to divine relationships, they provided models for human conflict resolution as well. Egyptian legal and diplomatic traditions drew heavily on the patterns established by Thoth's mediation methods. The emphasis on understanding underlying causes rather than just surface disagreements, the use of storytelling to reframe conflicts in more constructive terms, the patient approach that allowed time for emotional healing, all of these became standard elements of Egyptian peacekeeping practices. But Thoth's wisdom extended beyond conflict resolution to encompass a deeper understanding of how myths function in human society. As the god of writing and knowledge, he was understood to be the ultimate source of the stories that helped people make sense of their world. His role in preserving and transmitting these sacred narratives made him a crucial figure in maintaining cultural continuity and wisdom. This brings us to one of the most important aspects of Tefnut's story: its function as an explanation for natural phenomena that ancient Egyptians observed but couldn't explain through the scientific methods available to them. The myth provided a framework for understanding why droughts occurred, why they ended, and what humans could do to influence these crucial natural cycles. Ancient peoples around the world developed similar mythological explanations for the natural phenomena that most directly affected their lives. These stories weren't primitive attempts at science, they were sophisticated frameworks for understanding the complex relationships between human behavior, natural forces, and spiritual realities. The Egyptian understanding of drought as divine displeasure, for example, wasn't just a supernatural explanation. It encoded practical wisdom about the behaviors and attitudes that contributed to environmental sustainability. A society that understood its prosperity as dependent on divine favor was more likely to practice the kind of careful resource management and respectful environmental stewardship that actually did contribute to long-term survival. Tefnut's story taught that taking natural abundance for granted was spiritually dangerous and practically foolish. This wisdom encouraged careful water conservation, respectful use of natural resources, and the kind of community cooperation necessary to manage irrigation systems and food storage effectively during times of scarcity. The myth also provided psychological tools for coping with environmental crises that were beyond human control. During actual droughts, people could understand their suffering as part of a larger cosmic drama that would eventually resolve in restoration and renewal. This perspective helped maintain hope and social cohesion during times when despair might otherwise have led to community breakdown. The seasonal patterns that the myth explained were based on careful observation of actual climatic cycles. Egyptian priests maintained detailed records of flood levels, rainfall patterns, and agricultural yields over centuries. These observations informed their understanding of how divine relationships played out in the natural world, creating feedback loops between mythological narrative and empirical observation. The story's emphasis on the importance of proper relationships between family members, between rulers and subjects, between humans and the natural world, encoded social wisdom that contributed to the remarkable stability and longevity of Egyptian civilization. A culture that understood prosperity as dependent on maintaining harmony at all levels of existence was more likely to develop the social institutions and practices necessary for long-term success. But perhaps most importantly, myths like Tefnut's story provided ancient peoples with a sense of agency in the face of forces that seemed overwhelmingly powerful and unpredictable. By understanding natural disasters as the result of damaged relationships rather than random events, people could believe that their actions, their rituals, their moral behavior, their social cooperation could actually influence outcomes that mattered to their survival. This sense of meaningful participation in cosmic events gave ancient peoples psychological resources for coping with uncertainty and hardship that purely scientific explanations might not provide. Even when they couldn't control the weather directly, they could engage in actions that felt meaningful and potentially effective, maintaining their sense of dignity and purpose even during times of crisis. The artistic representations of Tefnut and her story that have survived from ancient Egypt provide additional insights into how this myth functioned in daily life. These weren't just decorative images, they were spiritual technologies designed to maintain connection between the human and divine worlds, ensuring that the goddess's power remained accessible to those who needed her blessing. In temple reliefs, Tefnut appears most commonly in her dual nature, sometimes as a beautiful woman with the head of a lioness, crowned with the solar disk that marked her as Ra's daughter, and sometimes as a full lioness whose powerful form radiated both protection and danger. These images weren't just artistic representations but were understood to be actual presences of the goddess, requiring the same respect and offerings that would be given to her living form. The solar disk that crowned Tefnut in many depictions wasn't merely a symbol of her relationship to Ra, it represented her role as the eye of the sun god, the focused beam of divine attention that could bring both blessing and judgment to the world below. This iconography reminded viewers that the goddess's power was both nurturing and potentially destructive, requiring careful attention to proper relationships and respectful behavior. The lioness form that Tefnut assumed during her exile was depicted with particular attention to the details that conveyed her divine nature. Her mane often flickered with representations of divine fire, her eyes blazed with inner light, and her claws were shown as curved daggers capable of tearing through the fabric of reality itself. These weren't naturalistic portraits of actual lions, they were theological statements about the nature of divine power when it turns destructive. But equally important were the images showing Tefnut's return and reconciliation. These relief carvings often depicted the goddess in procession surrounded by offerings and celebrations, her fierce lioness form gradually softening back into her more benevolent appearance. These artistic narratives served as visual prayers for continued divine favor and reminders of the possibility of redemption even after the most serious conflicts. The water symbols that surrounded Tefnut in artistic representations were particularly sophisticated in their iconographic meanings. Wavy lines representing flowing water, lotus blossoms emerging from pools, birds drinking from sacred streams, each element carried specific theological significance that would have been immediately recognizable to ancient viewers. The Ankh symbol, representing life itself, appeared frequently in association with Tefnut, often shown being poured from vessels like water or emerging from her hands like flowing streams. This iconography made explicit the connection between the goddess's power over moisture and her role in sustaining all life. To ancient Egyptian viewers, these images weren't just artistic compositions, they were visual statements about the fundamental nature of existence itself. Temple wall paintings often showed Tefnut in the company of other water-related deities, creating complex theological narratives about the relationships between different aspects of divine power. These ensemble compositions helped worshippers understand how various gods and goddesses work together to maintain cosmic harmony, reinforcing the social values of cooperation and mutual respect that kept Egyptian society functioning effectively. The colors used in these artistic representations carried deep symbolic meaning as well. The blue and green pigments used to depict water weren't just naturalistic color choices, they were spiritual statements about the life-giving properties of moisture. The gold used to highlight divine figures represented the solar power that worked with water to create the conditions necessary for life. Private tomb paintings often included scenes of the deceased enjoying eternal access to fresh water, with Tefnut or her symbols prominently featured as guarantors of continued refreshment in the afterlife. These images served both as prayers for the deceased's continued well-being and as reminders to the living about the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the forces that controlled life's essentials. Jewelry and amulets featuring Tefnut's image were worn not just as decorative objects, but as spiritual technologies designed to maintain connection with the goddess's power. Small carved lionesses, water symbols, and representations of the goddess herself were understood to carry actual protective and life-giving properties, making the wearer a walking participant in the divine order that Tefnut represented. These personal religious objects were particularly popular during times of drought or illness, when individuals needed direct access to the goddess's healing and sustaining power. The act of wearing Tefnut's image was understood to be a form of prayer that continued throughout the day, maintaining constant communication with the divine forces that controlled life and death. The sophistication of these artistic and material culture expressions of Tefnut's mythology demonstrates how deeply the story penetrated all aspects of Egyptian life. This wasn't just a tale told in temples by priests, it was a living reality that shaped how people understood their world and their place in it. What aspects of ancient religious art do you find most compelling? For me, it has to be the way these images functioned as actual spiritual technologies rather than just representations. The idea that art could be a form of active prayer and divine communication, that's a profound way of understanding creative expression. As we reflect on all these dimensions of Tefnut's story, its environmental wisdom, its psychological insights, its social teachings, its artistic expressions, we begin to see how this ancient myth speaks to concerns that remain vitally relevant in our contemporary world. The story of a goddess whose anger could devastate the natural world, whose reconciliation could restore abundance and harmony, offers profound lessons for our current environmental and social challenges. In our time of climate change and environmental crisis, Tefnut's story reminds us that the natural systems we depend on for survival are far more fragile and interconnected than we often realize. The goddess's ability to withdraw her blessing from an entire civilization demonstrates how quickly ecological balance can be disrupted and how catastrophic the consequences can be when that balance fails. But the story also offers hope. Tefnut's return wasn't the result of conquest or force. It came through patient diplomacy, genuine understanding, and the willingness to acknowledge mistakes and work toward reconciliation. This suggests that even our most serious environmental challenges might be addressed through similar approaches: careful attention to relationships, respect for natural systems, and the wisdom to seek balance rather than domination. The myth's emphasis on the interconnectedness of all life speaks directly to contemporary ecological understanding. Just as Tefnut's exile affected every aspect of Egyptian civilization, from the grandest temples to the humblest homes, our environmental choices today have far-reaching consequences that extend far beyond their immediate contexts. The story's focus on water as the fundamental element supporting all life has particular relevance as we face growing challenges related to water scarcity, pollution, and climate-related changes in precipitation patterns. Ancient Egypt's sophisticated understanding of water management, grounded in their spiritual relationship with Tefnut, offers insights that remain valuable for contemporary water conservation and management efforts. The social dimensions of Tefnut's story, the importance of community cooperation, the dangers of taking abundance for granted, the need for wise leadership during times of crisis speak to many of the challenges facing human societies today. The myth's emphasis on reconciliation and healing rather than conquest and domination offers alternative models for addressing conflicts at every scale, from family disputes to international relations. Perhaps most importantly, Tefnut's story reminds us that crises can become opportunities for growth and transformation. The goddess's exile, devastating as it was for Egypt, ultimately led to a deeper understanding of her importance and a more balanced relationship between divine and human concerns. This suggests that our current environmental and social challenges, difficult as they are, might also become catalysts for developing more sustainable and harmonious ways of living. The ancient Egyptian understanding that prosperity depends on maintaining proper relationships with family, community, and the natural world offers wisdom that transcends any particular religious or cultural context. These are insights that remain relevant regardless of our specific beliefs about divinity or the supernatural. As we face the uncertainties of our changing world, there's something deeply comforting about this ancient story of exile and return, crisis and renewal, separation and reconciliation. It reminds us that even the most overwhelming challenges can be addressed through patience, wisdom, and the willingness to seek understanding rather than simply imposing our will on forces beyond our control. The tears that Tefnut shed when she realized the consequences of her anger became the gentle rains that restored life to Egypt. Perhaps our own tears of concern for our world's future might similarly become sources of the compassion and wisdom needed to address the challenges we face. The goddess's story suggests that even our deepest sorrows and most overwhelming fears might be transformed into sources of healing and renewal. And so, as this long journey through the world of ancient Egypt and the realm of divine relationships draws to a close, we're left with images of restoration and hope. The great procession of Tefnut's return, with its music and celebration, its acknowledgement of past mistakes and commitment to future harmony, offers a vision of what reconciliation might look like in our own lives and communities. The gentle sound of the Nile flowing once again through the parched channels of Egypt, the sight of green shoots emerging from moistened earth, the joy of people who had despaired of ever seeing abundance again. These images remind us that renewal is always possible, that even the most damaged relationships can be healed, that life has an extraordinary capacity to recover from even the most devastating setbacks. Let the sound of her returning rains wash away the accumulated stresses and disappointments of your day, leaving behind the refreshed peace that comes from remembering that we are all part of a larger story of renewal and restoration. But before we close our eyes and drift into the realm of dreams, let us delve even deeper into the world that Tefnut inhabited and shaped. There are still so many layers to uncover, so many fascinating details that reveal just how profound and complex the ancient Egyptian understanding of divine relationships truly was. As we've seen, the story of Tefnut's exile and return wasn't just a mythological tale, it was a living reality that shaped every aspect of how Egyptians related to their environment. This connection between divine narrative and practical survival led to the development of some of the most sophisticated rainmaking rituals the ancient world ever knew. Picture yourself standing in a temple courtyard on a scorching afternoon during the dry season, when the Nile has receded to its lowest levels and the first whispers of concern about the coming flood begin to circulate among the priests. The air shimmers with heat, and every breath feels like inhaling fire. This is when the ancient Egyptians would begin their most sacred and desperate work. The rituals designed to ensure that Tefnut would remember her people and return with her life-giving moisture. These rainmaking ceremonies weren't simple superstitions performed by desperate people who didn't understand natural processes. They were elaborate, carefully orchestrated events that combined astronomical observation, agricultural knowledge, and profound psychological understanding of community needs during times of environmental stress. The preparations would begin months before the expected flood season, with priests consulting ancient texts and astronomical tables to determine the most auspicious times for each phase of the ritual process. Every detail was planned with meticulous care, from the specific types of offerings to be prepared to the exact movements and words that would be used during the ceremonies. The first phase involved purification rituals that could last for days. Participants would fast, bathe in sacred pools, and undergo elaborate cleansing ceremonies designed to make them worthy vessels for divine communication. The priests understood that approaching a goddess as powerful as Tefnut required not just physical cleanliness, but spiritual preparation that transformed the entire person. Water played a central role in these purification rites, but not just any water would suffice. Sacred water had to be collected from specific sources at particular times. The first flow of the annual flood, water from springs that had never run dry, rainwater collected during thunderstorms and preserved in sealed vessels throughout the dry season. Each type of water carried different spiritual properties that contributed to the overall effectiveness of the ritual. As the ceremonies progressed, participants would use this sacred water to create elaborate patterns on temple floors, drawing complex geometric designs that represented the cosmic forces they were attempting to influence. These weren't random decorative elements, they were sophisticated magical technologies based on centuries of accumulated knowledge about the relationships between earthly actions and divine responses. The offerings prepared for these rainmaking rituals were chosen with equal care and precision. Bread shaped like clouds, beer dyed blue to represent the color of storm-laden skies, honey mixed with precious oils to create sweet fragrances that would attract divine attention. Every element was selected for its symbolic significance and its ability to communicate specific messages to the goddesses who controlled moisture. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these ceremonies was their use of sympathetic magic, the principle that like produces like, that performing certain actions in the human realm could influence corresponding processes in the divine realm. Priests would pour vast quantities of water onto temple floors while chanting prayers for rain, creating artificial floods as a way of demonstrating to the gods what they hoped to see in the natural world. Women played particularly crucial roles in these rainmaking rituals, reflecting the understanding that feminine divine power was especially important in matters of fertility and life-giving moisture. Female dancers would perform choreographed movements that mimicked the motion of falling rain, the flow of rivers, and the growth of plants nourished by water. Their movements weren't just artistic expression, they were understood to be forms of prayer that used the language of the body to communicate with goddesses who themselves controlled the physical processes of nature. The music that accompanied these ritual dances was equally sophisticated in its symbolic content. Drums would beat in rhythms that echoed the sound of thunder, flutes would play melodies that rose and fell like wind carrying rain clouds, and voices would chant in harmonies that seemed to summon the very sound of falling water. Musicians spent years learning not just the technical aspects of their instruments, but the spiritual significance of each rhythm and melody. As the ceremonies reached their climax, the entire community would participate in acts of collective supplication. Mothers would bring their children to touch the sacred water, farmers would carry samples of soil from their fields to be blessed with moisture, and even the pharaoh would sometimes participate personally, understanding that the survival of his kingdom depended on maintaining proper relationships with the forces that controlled the rains. The emotional intensity of these events was tremendous. Participants weren't just going through the motions of ritual observance, they were pouring their deepest fears and hopes into collective actions that they truly believed could influence their survival. The sight of an entire community united in desperate prayer for rain created bonds of solidarity and shared purpose that strengthened social cohesion during times of environmental stress. What do you think would be the most emotionally powerful aspect of participating in such a ritual? For me, it would be the combination of individual vulnerability and collective strength. There's something deeply moving about people coming together in their shared dependence on forces beyond their control, but these rainmaking ceremonies weren't performed in isolation. They were part of a larger complex of beliefs and practices related to what Egyptians called the distant goddess tradition. This concept recognized that divine feminine power sometimes needed to withdraw from civilization, and that understanding and working with these cycles of absence and return was crucial for maintaining cosmic balance. The legend of the distant goddess appears in various forms throughout Egyptian mythology, but the core pattern remains remarkably consistent. A powerful goddess becomes angry or dissatisfied with conditions in Egypt and departs for distant lands, taking with her some essential aspect of life and prosperity. Her absence creates crisis and suffering, leading to diplomatic missions designed to persuade her to return. When she finally comes home, her return brings renewal and abundance greater than what existed before her departure. We've already explored this pattern in Tefnut's story, but she wasn't the only goddess to follow this archetypal journey. Hathor, Sekhmet, Bastet, and other feminine deities all have versions of the distant goddess narrative, each emphasizing different aspects of the relationship between divine feminine power and human welfare. In some versions, the goddess departs because humans have failed to show proper respect for the natural world. She becomes disgusted with pollution, waste, and the destruction of sacred places, leading her to withdraw her blessing until people learn to live more harmoniously with their environment. These stories served as powerful environmental parables, teaching practical lessons about sustainability through mythological narrative. Other versions focus on the goddess's need for periodic solitude and renewal. Just as the land itself requires fallow periods to restore its fertility, divine feminine power sometimes needs to withdraw from active engagement with the world in order to regenerate its creative potentials. These stories normalized the cycles of activity and rest that characterize healthy relationships and sustainable practices. The return of the distant goddess was always marked by spectacular celebrations that combined religious devotion with practical preparation for renewed abundance. Communities would prepare elaborate welcoming ceremonies, creating processional routes decorated with flowers and flowing water, organizing festivals that could last for weeks, and establishing new traditions designed to honor the goddess and prevent future departures. These homecoming celebrations weren't just expressions of relief and gratitude, they were opportunities for communities to recommit themselves to the behaviors and attitudes that maintained divine favor. People would make new pledges about environmental stewardship, social cooperation, and spiritual devotion, understanding that the goddess's return created both opportunity and responsibility. The artistic representations of these distant goddess myths were among the most sophisticated productions of ancient Egyptian culture. Temple walls would be covered with elaborate narrative sequences showing the goddess's departure, her adventures in foreign lands, the diplomatic missions sent to retrieve her, and her triumphant return. These visual stories served as both historical records and instructional materials for future generations. But the distant goddess tradition also recognized that divine feminine power, when separated from its proper context, could become dangerous and destructive. Goddesses in exile often transformed into terrifying forces that threatened not just their own homelands, but the entire cosmic order. This understanding led to the development of sophisticated diplomatic and magical techniques for managing divine relationships during times of crisis. The animals associated with these distant goddesses provide another fascinating window into ancient Egyptian spiritual understanding. The lioness, in particular, appears repeatedly as the form assumed by goddesses during their periods of exile and rage. This wasn't arbitrary symbolism. It reflected deep observation of actual lion behavior and its metaphorical significance for understanding divine psychology. Lions were both revered and feared in ancient Egypt, representing the perfect balance of protective power and potential danger that characterized divine feminine energy. Female lions, as the primary hunters in their prides, embodied the fierce maternal instinct that could nurture cubs while destroying threats. Their ability to disappear into the desert and reappear without warning made them perfect symbols for goddesses whose favor could never be taken for granted. The cat, as the domesticated relative of the lion, served as a bridge between the terrifying power of wild feline deities and the gentle, nurturing aspects of feminine divinity. Cats were sacred to Bastet, the goddess of joy and domesticity, but they retained enough of their wild nature to serve as reminders that even the most benevolent divine forces required respect and proper treatment. Egyptian households throughout the kingdom kept cats not just as practical pest controllers, but as living connections to the divine realm. These weren't just pets. They were understood to be representatives of goddess power in domestic spaces, deserving of honor and careful treatment. The death of a household cat was mourned with rituals similar to those performed for human family members. The ibis, sacred to Thoth, represented a different aspect of the relationship between divine and natural worlds. These elegant wading birds served as perfect symbols for wisdom that could navigate between different realms, moving effortlessly between land and water, between the practical and the spiritual, between human needs and divine requirements. Watching ibises probe the muddy shallows of the Nile with their long, curved beaks provided ancient Egyptians with a perfect metaphor for the kind of patient, careful investigation required to understand divine will. The birds' ability to find hidden sustenance beneath murky surfaces made them ideal symbols for Thoth's capacity to discover truth beneath the confusion of surface appearances. Crocodiles presented perhaps the most complex symbolic challenges, representing divine power that was essential but extremely dangerous. As lords of the Nile waters, crocodiles controlled access to the river that sustained all Egyptian life. They had to be respected and appeased, but they could never be fully trusted or controlled. The crocodile god Sobek embodied this paradox perfectly, serving as both protector and potential destroyer of those who depended on the river. His priests developed elaborate rituals for managing this relationship, including the maintenance of sacred crocodiles in temple pools where they could be honored and studied without posing direct threats to human communities. These sacred animals weren't just symbols, they were understood to be actual manifestations of divine presence in the physical world. Their behavior was carefully observed for signs and omens, their needs were attended to with the same care given to human priests, and their deaths were mourned as genuine losses to the spiritual community. What's your relationship with animals in your spiritual or emotional life? For me, it's the way they seem to exist so naturally in the present moment. There's something deeply calming about that kind of complete presence and acceptance. The temples where these sacred animals lived were themselves marvels of ancient engineering, designed to celebrate and manage the divine power of water in all its forms. These weren't just religious buildings, they were sophisticated technologies for storing, channeling, and celebrating the precious resource that made all life possible. The temple complex at Philae, dedicated to Isis and closely associated with Tefnut's mythology, was built on an island in the Nile and designed to work with the river's natural rhythms. During flood season, the rising waters would surround the temple with a sacred lake, making it accessible only by boat and creating the impression that the entire complex was floating on the divine waters of creation. The engineering required to achieve these effects was extraordinary. Ancient architects had to calculate water levels, seasonal variations, structural loads, and aesthetic effects with remarkable precision. Underground channels carried water to sacred pools throughout the complex. Fountains created the constant sound of flowing water that enhanced the spiritual atmosphere, and drainage systems ensured that flooding enhanced rather than damaged the sacred spaces. The sound design of these temple complexes was particularly sophisticated. Water was channeled through carefully shaped passages that created specific acoustic effects. The gentle murmur of shallow streams in meditation areas, the dramatic rush of artificial waterfalls in ceremonial spaces, the rhythmic dripping of sacred springs that marked time like cosmic metronomes. These weren't accidental effects, they were deliberately engineered features designed to create optimal conditions for spiritual experience. The ancient Egyptians understood that sound could profoundly influence consciousness, and they used their mastery of hydraulic engineering to create acoustic environments that facilitated communion with divine forces. The visual effects were equally impressive. Sacred pools were designed to reflect temple walls and ceilings in ways that created the illusion of infinite sacred space, extending both above and below the water's surface. Precious stones and metals were used to line pool bottoms, creating shimmering effects when viewed through moving water that seemed to reveal glimpses of divine realms. During certain times of the year, the angle of sunlight entering these temple pools would create spectacular displays of reflected light dancing on walls and ceilings. These natural light shows were understood to be manifestations of divine presence, moments when the physical and spiritual realms became visibly interconnected. The maintenance of these complex water systems required teams of skilled specialists who combined engineering knowledge with spiritual understanding. These weren't just technicians, they were priests whose technical expertise was understood to be a form of religious devotion. Their daily work of maintaining pumps, clearing channels, and monitoring water levels was performed with the same reverence given to other forms of ritual service. Storage systems within these temple complexes were designed to preserve sacred water through the dry season, ensuring that religious observances could continue even when external water sources were limited. Underground cisterns, carefully sealed vessels, and elaborate filtration systems maintained water quality over months of storage, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of both hydraulic engineering and water chemistry. But beyond their practical functions, these temple water systems served as powerful symbols of cosmic order and divine providence. The sight of abundant flowing water in the midst of desert landscapes reminded visitors that divine power could create abundance even in the harshest conditions, that proper relationships with the gods could literally make the desert bloom. The relationship between these engineering marvels and the principle of Ma'at, cosmic balance and justice, was fundamental to Egyptian understanding of how human civilization should relate to natural forces. Ma'at wasn't just an abstract philosophical concept, it was a practical principle that guided everything from personal behavior to architectural design. The goddess Ma'at, with her ostrich feather crown and scales of justice, represented the cosmic order that kept the universe functioning properly. Her principle taught that all aspects of existence, divine and human, natural and artificial, individual and collective, were interconnected parts of a greater whole that required careful balance to maintain harmony. In the context of water management and environmental stewardship, Ma'at's principle meant that human activities should work with, rather than against, natural cycles and processes. The sophisticated irrigation systems that sustained Egyptian agriculture were designed to enhance and distribute the Nile's natural flood, not to fight against or replace it. This approach required deep understanding of natural systems and humble acceptance of human limitations. Egyptian engineers didn't try to control the river completely. They developed technologies that worked with its rhythms, storing water during abundant times and distributing it carefully during periods of scarcity. The principle of Ma also governed social relationships during times of environmental stress. When droughts or floods threatened community survival, resources were distributed according to principles of justice and mutual aid, rather than pure market forces or political power. The goddess's scales reminded everyone that individual survival was meaningless if the community as a whole couldn't thrive. This wasn't just idealistic philosophy, it was practical wisdom that contributed to Egypt's remarkable resilience during environmental crises. Communities that shared resources fairly and cooperated effectively were more likely to survive difficult periods than those that allowed individual hoarding or social conflict to undermine collective efforts. The legal systems that governed water rights and usage were based on Ma'at's principles of balance and reciprocity. Upstream users had obligations to downstream communities, private landowners had responsibilities to maintain common irrigation infrastructure, and everyone was expected to contribute to the collective effort required to manage water resources effectively. But Ma'at's influence extended beyond practical resource management to encompass the spiritual and artistic dimensions of Egyptian culture. The principle of balance governed everything from the composition of temple art to the structure of religious festivals, creating a comprehensive cultural system that reinforced harmonious relationships at every level of society. The festivals celebrating Tefnut's return and the renewal of the rains were carefully designed according to Ma'at's principles, balancing joy with solemnity, individual expression with collective participation, celebration of divine power with acknowledgement of human responsibility. These weren't just parties, they were sophisticated social technologies that reinforced community bonds and cultural values during times of transition and renewal. The music performed during these festivals demonstrates the profound integration of artistic expression with spiritual and social purposes that characterized Egyptian culture. Musicians weren't just entertainers, they were ritual specialists whose performances served essential functions in maintaining cosmic balance and community harmony. The instruments used in water festivals were chosen for their ability to evoke specific aspects of aquatic experience. Sistrums, with their distinctive rattling sound, mimicked the sound of rain on temple roofs and river reeds. Drums of various sizes recreated the rhythms of flowing water, from the gentle lapping of calm pools to the thunderous rush of flood-season torrents. Flutes and other wind instruments were understood to represent the breath of life that moved across the waters of creation, the same divine breath that had originally brought Tefnut and Shu into existence. The melodies played on these instruments weren't just beautiful sounds, they were prayers made audible, communications with divine forces that transcended the limitations of ordinary speech. Vocal music during these festivals was particularly sophisticated, incorporating complex harmonies that were understood to represent the multiple voices of divine creation working together in cosmic symphony. Choirs would sing antiphonally, with different groups representing different aspects of the water cycle: rain clouds calling to earth, rivers answering the ocean, springs responding to underground streams. The lyrics of these sacred songs weren't just poetic expressions of religious devotion, they were carefully crafted communications that combined theological accuracy with emotional power. Every word was chosen for its spiritual significance, as well as its aesthetic impact, creating texts that could move listeners to tears while also teaching them essential truths about divine relationships. Dance during these festivals served similar functions, using the language of physical movement to express spiritual truths that couldn't be captured in words alone. Dancers would move in patterns that mimicked natural processes: the swaying of reeds in riverside breezes, the circular flow of water in temple pools, the dramatic gestures of storms gathering and releasing their moisture. But these weren't just representational movements. They were understood to be forms of sympathetic magic that could actually influence the processes they depicted. Dancers performing rain ceremonies believed that their movements could help summon actual precipitation, that their bodies could serve as channels for divine energy seeking expression in the physical world. The costumes and makeup used in these ritual performances were equally significant, incorporating colors, patterns, and materials that reinforced the spiritual messages being conveyed through music and movement. Blues and greens evoked the life-giving properties of water. Silver and gold represented the divine light that illuminated sacred waters. Flowing fabrics mimicked the movement of streams and rivers. What role does music or dance play in your own life when you're dealing with difficult emotions? For me, it's the way rhythm and movement can help process feelings that are too complex for words. There's something deeply healing about letting your body express what your mind can't quite understand. These artistic expressions weren't separate from the magical and healing traditions that were so important to Egyptian culture. They were integral parts of comprehensive approaches to restoration and renewal that addressed spiritual, emotional, and physical dimensions of human experience simultaneously. The legends of magical healing and restoration that surround figures like Tefnut demonstrate the sophisticated understanding ancient Egyptians had of the connections between psychological, social, and environmental health. They recognized that true healing required addressing not just immediate symptoms, but the underlying imbalances that created conditions for illness and suffering. When Tefnut's tears began to fall as healing rain after her return from exile, this wasn't just poetic metaphor, it represented a sophisticated understanding of how emotional resolution could create conditions for physical and environmental restoration. The goddess's personal healing became the foundation for healing the entire land of Egypt. This principle was applied in countless healing traditions throughout Egyptian culture. Healers would address not just physical symptoms, but the spiritual and emotional imbalances that contributed to illness. Treatments might involve ritual purification, meditation beside sacred pools, participation in community ceremonies, and the use of blessed water in various medicinal preparations. The water used in healing rituals was understood to carry specific properties depending on its source and the ceremonies performed over it. Water blessed during Tefnut's festivals carried the goddess's power to restore emotional balance and heal relationships. Water collected during thunderstorms was thought to contain the electrical energy needed to jumpstart sluggish bodily processes. Sacred springs throughout Egypt became centers for healing pilgrimages, where people would travel to bathe in waters believed to carry the direct blessing of various deities. These weren't just superstitious practices, they were sophisticated therapeutic approaches that combined hydrotherapy, community support, spiritual counseling, and environmental healing in comprehensive treatment programs. The amulets and magical objects associated with water deities served similar functions, providing portable connections to divine healing power that could be accessed whenever needed. These weren't just symbolic reminders, they were understood to be actual repositories of spiritual energy that could be activated through proper prayer and ritual use. The spells and incantations used in conjunction with these healing objects demonstrate the ancient Egyptian understanding that words themselves could serve as medicine when properly applied. These weren't random magical formulas, they were carefully crafted communications that addressed specific aspects of illness and healing with remarkable psychological sophistication. Healing ceremonies often involved the reenactment of mythological stories, with patients taking on the roles of various deities in narratives of crisis and restoration. By identifying with figures like Tefnut, who had overcome their own difficulties and found renewal, patients could access psychological resources that supported their own healing processes. But perhaps the most profound aspect of these healing traditions was their recognition that individual restoration was inseparable from environmental and community healing. The stories of Tefnut and other deities taught that personal problems were often symptoms of larger imbalances that required collective attention and effort to resolve. This understanding led to healing approaches that involved entire communities in restoration processes. When someone was seriously ill, their healing might require not just individual treatment, but community-wide ceremonies, environmental restoration projects, and collective commitments to behavioral changes that would support long-term health and balance. The desert landscapes where much of this healing work took place weren't seen as hostile environments to be avoided. They were understood to be powerful teachers that could provide essential lessons about resilience, transformation, and hope. The harsh conditions of desert life stripped away all non-essentials, forcing people to focus on what truly mattered for survival and well-being. The experience of living with minimal water taught profound lessons about gratitude, conservation, and the preciousness of life's basic necessities. Desert storms, with their dramatic displays of natural power, demonstrated that even the most overwhelming forces could pass, leaving behind renewed landscapes and clearer skies. The sight of desert plants blooming after rare rains provided powerful metaphors for the human capacity to find beauty and renewal even after the most difficult periods. The silence and vastness of desert spaces created optimal conditions for deep reflection and spiritual insight. Away from the distractions of everyday life, people could encounter aspects of themselves and their relationships that remained hidden in more comfortable environments. Many of the most important revelations in Egyptian mythology took place in desert settings, reinforcing the understanding that difficult experiences often contain the greatest potential for growth and transformation. Tefnut's own journey through the Nubian desert was essential to her eventual ability to return as a wiser and more compassionate goddess. The navigation skills required for desert survival provided metaphors for finding direction during times of confusion and uncertainty. Just as desert travelers learned to read subtle signs in landscape and sky, people facing personal crises could learn to recognize the subtle guidance available to them even in the most challenging circumstances. The water conservation techniques developed for desert survival taught lessons about managing all kinds of resources more carefully and effectively. The desert's harsh feedback about wasteful practices provided immediate and undeniable education about the consequences of taking abundance for granted. The community cooperation required for successful desert travel reinforced the social values that sustained Egyptian civilization during times of environmental stress. The desert's dangers could only be overcome through mutual aid, shared knowledge, and collective commitment to everyone's survival. But perhaps most importantly, the desert taught that renewal and transformation were always possible, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The sight of an oasis appearing in the midst of seemingly endless desolation provided hope that even the most desperate situations contained the possibility of unexpected relief and restoration. As we reach the end of this long journey through the world of ancient Egypt and the profound wisdom contained in Tefnut's story, we're left with images and insights that remain deeply relevant to our contemporary experience. The desert's lessons about resilience and transformation speak directly to anyone facing personal challenges or environmental crises. The ancient understanding that individual healing and environmental restoration are inseparable parts of a larger process offers guidance for addressing the complex, interconnected problems we face in our modern world. The recognition that crisis often contains the seeds of renewal provides hope during times when solutions seem impossible to imagine. The sophisticated integration of practical knowledge with spiritual wisdom that characterized Egyptian culture suggests approaches to problem solving that honor both scientific understanding and deeper sources of insight and guidance. The emphasis on community cooperation and mutual aid offers alternatives to individualistic approaches that often prove inadequate for addressing collective challenges. Most fundamentally, Tefnut's story reminds us that even the most overwhelming forces can be approached with patience, wisdom, and love. The goddess's journey from destructive rage through healing exile to compassionate service demonstrates that transformation is always possible, that our deepest wounds can become sources of our greatest wisdom and strength. As you prepare for sleep tonight, carried by the gentle rhythms of this ancient story, may you find in its images of renewal and restoration a source of hope for your own challenges and difficulties. May the wisdom of the desert teach you about resilience and patience. May the sound of returning rains remind you that even the longest droughts eventually end. And may the gentle presence of the goddess who learned to transform her tears of sorrow into tears of healing comfort you through whatever difficulties you may be facing. Let the profound silence of the desert night surround you with its peace, knowing that in that silence, profound transformations are always taking place. Rest in the knowledge that every crisis contains the potential for growth, that every ending makes possible a new beginning, and that even the most difficult journeys can lead to destinations of unexpected beauty and grace. Sleep well, dear listeners, knowing that the ancient wisdom we've explored together tonight continues to offer guidance and comfort to all who seek to understand the delicate balance between holding on and letting go, between the necessity of sometimes standing alone and the deeper necessity of always finding our way home. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the gentle sound of life-giving rain, the sight of green landscapes restored to abundance, and the deep peace that comes from knowing that renewal is always possible, even in the midst of the harshest deserts of the heart.